One, two, three. Aloha, I'm JB Friday. I am with the University of Hawaii, and today we're going to be talking about ʻŌhiʻa and a new threat to ʻŌhiʻa, rapid ʻŌhiʻa death. I'm the extension forester, so I work with foresters, I work with landowners, I work with pretty much anything that's about taking care of the forest. And the past few years, most of my job has been focused on trying to help prevent the spread of rapid ʻŌhiʻa death. You see here my contact information and some of my websites. I'm also on Instagram, Flickr, and Facebook. If you want to follow me, I do a lot of photography and post them on those things if you want to learn about some of these other topics. ʻŌhiʻa, what is ʻŌhiʻa? ʻŌhiʻa is an endemic tree. That means it is only in Hawaii. There are other relatives of ʻŌhiʻa across the Pacific, like there's some other ones in New Zealand, the Potokawa tree, but there are a bunch of different kinds of ʻŌhiʻa, but they're all, the true ʻŌhiʻa is only native to Hawaii, only found in Hawaii. It's very variable. Some ʻŌhiʻa are just little tiny shrubs, like the ones up in the bogs in Kauai. Some are huge trees. The biggest ʻŌhiʻa that I know is as wide across at its base as I am tall. So I'm 6'3", so it's 6.5 feet almost across, hundreds of years old. ʻŌhiʻa also goes all the way down to the coastline here on Hawaii Island. You go down Lower Puna, you can see ʻŌhiʻa growing right on the coastline, right next to the water. You can go all the way up to 9,000 feet on top of the mountains and see ʻŌhiʻa. It's a pioneer and a keystone tree, which is an ecologist way of explaining that ʻŌhiʻa is one of the first trees, or really the first tree that comes in the lava. So you see the little picture on the bottom, that's Kilauea Iki. So that is lava that dates from 1958 eruption, and the ʻŌhiʻa are already growing right there in lava. But the keystone is it's the most important tree in the native forest, and really is the tree that holds everything else together. And it's the dominant tree, so it's the main tree in our medium and our wet forests across all the islands of Hawaii. It's a huge tree in the canopy. As I said, these trees that form the forest canopy, it can be a very enormous tree, and you see your typical wet ʻŌhiʻa forest with a few other trees in the understory and then the hapu'u. The values of the ʻŌhiʻa are much more about the forest itself than about wood. So when I talk to mainland foresters, they say, well, how many board feet are harvested a year? And I said, that's not the question. The ʻŌhiʻa's value is what it does for us. The most important thing ʻŌhiʻa does is it protects our watersheds. So ʻŌhiʻa, you can see it as the water collector tree. The rain that falls on our upper mountain watersheds that gives us all our water for living, for agriculture, that all falls on the ʻŌhiʻa forests. ʻŌhiʻa is habitat for all our native birds. So you see here an amakihi and an apapane. They live in the ʻŌhiʻa. They drink the ʻŌhiʻa nectar. They live in nests in the ʻŌhiʻa trees. If it weren't for the ʻŌhiʻa forest, we wouldn't have our native birds. It's culturally important in native Hawaiian culture. ʻŌhiʻa lei are really beautiful. In fact, that lei is if you look at the yellow and red lei there, the lei maker took apart the ʻŌhiʻa blossoms to the individual flowers and then wound them in a double strand lei for that. ʻŌhiʻa wood was used for the lele or the altar. So that's pu'ukoʻola heiau, and the altar in front of that is made of ʻŌhiʻa wood. Modern times, ʻŌhiʻa is used for building, mostly for posts and balustrades and stuff, for woodworking and carving, for firewood. People make imu here on the Big Island. They make ʻŌhiʻa firewood. And landscaping, here at least in East Hawaii, most people have an ʻŌhiʻa tree in their front yard. This is a picture of an ʻŌhiʻa forest down by Pahoa and Puna in 2005. It was a beautiful forest, tall trees. It had all kinds of other native plants on the understory. It had the endangered haʻiwale, the native Hawaiian African violet, living in the understory. And it hadn't been developed and was starting to be preserved and protected as a forest. This is what the forest looked 10 years later. This is what rapid ʻŌhiʻa death can do to a forest. Almost all the trees in this forest are killed by rapid ʻŌhiʻa death. Then the blast of sunlight came in, killed the understory trees, and now what you've got is a weed patch. Underneath these trees, they're just weeds, mostly Maile pilau growing there. Now, you can see one tree off to the left. There's one survivor ʻŌhiʻa tree. We're wondering maybe that's resistant to disease, so we are taking some samples of that tree and trying to grow it out, because that may be the one survivor of the devastation that's hit this forest and hit a lot of forests in our island. So what is rapid ʻŌhiʻa death? Rapid ʻŌhiʻa death is a disease caused by a fungus. Now, the scientific name for the fungus is ceratocystis. This is a genus of fungi that around the world causes diseases. So there's a different related fungus that causes diseases of mango in India. There's one that causes a disease of oak trees on the mainland. There's ceratocystis diseases all around the world. This one for ʻŌhiʻa is new. As far as we know, we never heard of it before a couple of years ago. The diseases enter the tree through wounds or injuries, so it gets through the bark, just like your skin protects you from infections, bark protects trees. You don't see the fungus on the outside. What you're looking at here, all this black streaking is the fungus. So all this black streaking, when you cut into the tree, you see it. So when we first saw these trees dying, we didn't see mushrooms growing out of them or bracket fungus growing out of them. The fungus doesn't work that way. It's all pretty much inside the forest, the tree in the wood. Mostly where it grows is inside the sapwood. So if you look at the cross section of the tree there, you see that black streaking. You see it's red wood inside, and that's kind of a heartwood. And then the light cream colored wood around the outside, right underneath the bark, is called the sapwood. That's called sapwood because that's where the water moves from the roots up to the crown of the tree. It moves to the sapwood. It doesn't go in the middle of the tree, that dark brown and blackish colored wood. That's not transporting water anymore. It's that light cream colored wood right under the bark. That's the sapwood. And the problem is the fungus grows there too, and the fungus blocks the water supply. And what happens when it blocks the water supply? There's no water to the leaves die, the tree dies. Now, this type of fungus only lives in the wood. It doesn't live in the leaves. It doesn't live in the flowers. It doesn't live in the seeds. I don't know if any of you have ever looked at ʻŌhiʻa seeds, but there's a picture of me holding out a notebook and shaking the seeds out from the capsules onto a piece of paper. So ʻŌhiʻa has millions of tiny little seeds, but the fungus isn't in the seeds. The fungus is in the wood. So what happens? What does the tree look like when it dies? What happens is the water doesn't get up to the crown of the tree and the leaves die. This happens very quickly, relatively quickly. This happens in a couple weeks. Really what happens is the fungus grows for a long time, but suddenly at some point it hits a tipping point and then the whole tree collapses. So that's why we called it rapid ʻŌhiʻa death, because it was rapid. It rather than it, the tree wasn't declining over months and months. The tree looked healthy until right before it died, and it was surprising to see how quickly they died. Now, we know now that the fungus grows inside the tree for a long time before the tree dies, but when we first were seeing it, we didn't know that was what was happening. One of the other things we did notice is it affected large, healthy trees. So it wasn't a stress. It wasn't like the trees that were not growing well died. It was the large, healthy trees that died. One of the things, there are other diseases that kill ʻŌhiʻa, and you don't really know if it's rapid ʻŌhiʻa death until you take a sample of the wood, take the fungus into the lab, and examine it. So here are a couple other symptoms of what it looks like. So you see the tree on the left is all brown. This is actually a photo some lady sent to me and said, "Hey, do you think my tree is rot?" And I looked at it and I said, "Yeah, it does." In fact, she was one of the first people in Kona to report it. So we had people go over and sample it, and sure enough, it was rot. So it's got all the leaves on the crown, but they're brown, and they used to be nice. So she could see this out her window, and she said it was green just recently, and then it turned all brown. And the tree on the right, where the guy cutting it down, I drive past that tree all the time. And one day I noticed it all turned brown, and sure enough, we cut it up, and there it was. So where is the disease on the Big Island? Now, this is a map of aerial survey of brown-crowned ʻŌhiʻa trees on the island last year. So the surveyor, this is Greg Asner, who has an observatory laboratory. He flew the entire island, or at least all the parts that had ʻŌhiʻa forest, with his plane, and mapped all the brown ʻŌhiʻa crowns. So his imagery analysis, he can tell which trees are ʻŌhiʻa versus what's eucalyptus and which is kukui, and then all the ones that had turned brown. This map makes it look worse than it is because then in order to show up on the map, he blew up each point as if it were 400 feet across. So, that's not the point of the map. But what it does show you, it shows you where on the island it is. And you see it's pretty much in the southern 2/3 of the island across. So it's scattered around the ʻŌhiʻa area, a lot of it in Puna, then a lot of it in Kau, and then particularly up the Kona area. But again, the lower elevation forest in Kona area is getting hammered. If you get up higher, you don't have so much ʻŌhiʻa. And I want you to bear that point in mind. When you get up higher, you don't see so much disease. It's really the lower elevation ʻŌhiʻa. He's done this several times, and with some other imagery, we put together and did the math, and our estimate is that over 1 million ʻŌhiʻa on our island have died from rapid ʻŌhiʻa death. Now, that's a lot, but our island has hundreds of millions of ʻŌhiʻa on it. So we don't want it to keep going like this, but so far, still most of the trees are healthy. Greg, as I said, has been flying the island for several years, and there are a couple things that you can see here in the differences between the 2017 and the 2019 map. And I'm hoping this works. There we go. So in 2017, this disease started in Lower Puna. 2017, we saw a lot of disease in Lower Puna. And by 2019, we see less. And I am afraid the reason for that is so much of the ʻŌhiʻa died already in Lower Puna that you're seeing less disease in Lower Puna. But what we are seeing is we're seeing a lot more disease uphill. So when we look uphill above Hilo and Waikea, we're seeing a lot more disease now. So this is new. We're predicting where it's going. We can see where it has been, but we're trying to guess where the disease is going to go. We really hope it's not going to be as severe up in these higher elevations as it was down in Puna. Where did the fungus come from? It had to come from somewhere. Well, it turns out that once they identified the fungus under the microscope, they sent DNA to the lab that did genetics of this kind of fungus, and they got its DNA fingerprint, and the answer came back, said, well, you're talking two different species of this fungus. One seems to be related to ones that came from Latin America and maybe from Florida. The other seems to be related to species that came from Asia, maybe from China. So we're going to focus on the one that's the more virulent. They got Hawaiian names. Well, we gave them Hawaiian names. And it was a question, is it a good thing to give something that's killing Hawaiian trees a Hawaiian name? But since it's only known in Hawaii, they gave them Hawaiian names. I'm going to get that to the next page here. So the one that does the most destruction we called Ceratocystis leuco-ʻŌhiʻa. Now I live in Hilo, right by the Wailuku River, and that means the river of destruction because it's a very violent river and people drown in there a lot. So leuco-ʻŌhiʻa means that which destroys ʻŌhiʻa. The other one was named Ceratocystis huli-ʻŌhiʻa. Now huli, you don't think huli huli chicken, think huli de canoe out in the ocean, yeah? So huli means to overturn, that which turns over ʻŌhiʻa. So we had people doing the genetics with it and then described what the fungus was. And then they found out these two different fungi cause somewhat different diseases. Leuco-ʻŌhiʻa causes something called ʻŌhiʻa wilt, and huli-ʻŌhiʻa causes something called ʻŌhiʻa canker. So the guy with the black beard there, he's a forest pathologist, and he studies tree diseases in the forest. He's Dr. Mark Hughes. The lady with the red hair is Jenny Juswick, and she studies forest diseases in the Midwest. So she lives in Minnesota. So she studies diseases there, but it turns out there's a different fungus that's related in Minnesota that she has studied for a long time. So she really understands this disease. So she's coming out here and helped us with this. And what she likes to do, it's interesting, she likes to dissect diseased trees. So this picture of them is at a sawmill. So we cut the tree down and cut it up into slices and looked at its anatomy and see where the fungus was on it. And then Mark is showing what it looks like out there in the field. When you cut the tree up is when you see the fungus. So internally you see the symptoms. You see this black streaking in it, and that's actually the fungal spores inside the wood. So this cross section, you see that whole ring of black streaking there. And this was a tree that completely died of it. That's all the fungus. And you see it just in the sapwood. It doesn't go inside to the heartwood. It does get a little bit into the phloem under the bark there. Now the two species move through the wood differently. So they did a bunch of experiments where they actually inoculated healthy trees with the fungus. So you see that disc in the log on the top. They cut out it and they cut out the bark and they put some of the fungus on it. And then they looked at it, they cut the tree down 3 months later, peeled all the bark off, and they could see that the fungus had gone all the way up the whole tree in 3 months. Now, ʻŌhiʻa moves a lot more slowly. So that tree, you can see they inoculated it. 3 months later, they cut up and peeled the bark, and it only went about a foot in either direction of it. So they looked at how the fungus moves through the tree before it kills it. How does the fungus move through the forest? Well, one of the things that happens is it turns out this fungus has a really hard time getting into a healthy tree. Like I said, just like your skin protects you from infection, the bark protects a tree. But things that break through the bark allow the tree to get infected. So this was a forest where the guys are driving by and they said, hey, the trees are all dying. What's going on? They got out and they went inside and they found there were a lot of goats inside that forest. And the goats were peeling the bark off the trees. This was down in Ka'u, where it was really rocky, so there was no grass or anything else for the goats to eat. They were getting at the trees and they're peeling the bark off. Then they noticed when they looked closely at the bark, we saw all that black fungus on the inside underneath where the bark was. And bingo, that was it. That was the ceratocystis. So in this case, goats peeling the bark off caused the disease to be able to infect the trees. In fact, this is a map of Hawaii Volcanoes National Park in the Kahuku unit. They have done hundreds of samples, but in the Kahuku unit, they have found, I think, 60 trees positive now, maybe 65, but they're all below the fence line. In the Kahuku, they have a fence line, and there are a lot of goats below the fence line and not goats above the fence line. So in the area where there are a lot of goats damaging the trees, there's where you're seeing a lot of disease. This map is a more complicated map, but you may recognize this as Volcano Village. And in this map, the small red dots and the small purple dots are trees that aerial survey identified as ʻŌhiʻa trees that had turned brown. The white lines are fences that keep out, in this case, mostly pigs, goats, and cattle. And so what pattern do you see when you look at that? The pattern that I see is there are a whole lot of dots outside the fences and not very many at all inside the fences. So where you keep the pigs out, you have less disease. You've got as much fungus on either side of the fence because a fence isn't going to stop fungus. But in this case, the fence is stopping the pigs. So maybe what's happening is the pigs, as they root around, they tear up the roots, and maybe the fungus is getting in the roots. We're not sure of that yet. This is just what we're seeing on the ground. So we still have a project going on to look at what's going on at the root level, and is the fungus actually able to get up through the roots and infect those trees? Because that would make sense, because pigs don't peel bark the way goats do, or cattle, but they do tear roots up. How does the fungus itself move around? Well, we have 3 ways we know it moves around, and we're still really trying to evaluate what's going on with this. People moving stuff, beetles moving stuff, and wind blowing. So one way of moving the disease around is moving infected logs around. Now, you look at the logs on the bottom left, that's a pile of firewood. That was the owner of the forest, where it had a lot of disease. In fact, the disease killed almost all his ʻŌhiʻa trees in his forest. He cut them up to make firewood to burn in his wood stove. And where he lives, it's really wet. So he just liked to have a wood stove going to dry the house out. And that was a good thing that he used the wood right there. He didn't spread the disease by doing that, and he got rid of his trees. You can see the black rings on all those trees, and that's the fungus. The picture on the right was a landowner who cut posts to make a house out of, but she was going to build a house on Kauai. So she was going to ship all those logs to Kauai, and we came and tested the logs and found that they were full of the disease. And Department of Ag said, you can't have a permit to ship those logs because you'll be moving the disease to Kauai. So one of the ways I think the disease has gotten around, and I suspect that the way it's gotten around different islands, is people have moved infected wood. Probably they didn't know what they were doing, but I think that's a good way of the disease to get around. One other way it can get around is through cutting tools. So if you cut into a infected tree with a chainsaw or even with an axe or a machete, you've picked up spores on your blade there. So I don't know if you can see by the axe, there's some black streaks in the wood there. That tree was infected. So if that same axe were used to prune another tree, bingo, you would have moved it tree to tree. And on the mainland, I mentioned they have an oak disease on the mainland. They found this is a major way that the disease moves around is people pruning trees, and they go tree to tree with a tool, and that infected tool infects other trees. But a main way we think it moves around is that the sick trees attract a lot of beetles, and the beetles drill into the wood and they create this sawdust or frass that blows around in the wind. Now, what we're finding is that the beetles don't usually attack healthy trees. For whatever reason, beetles can smell sick trees, and so they attack sick trees. And this kind of beetle, they're called ambrosia beetles, they bore right into the wood. So bottom left, you can see wood split open and one of those little beetles drilling in. They live inside the wood. But in order to drill inside the wood, they have to chew up the wood and spit it out. That's called frass. And so these trees that have hundreds and hundreds of beetles in them, you can see on the bark, it's got that powdery frass on the bark. Now we know that that frass has spores for the fungus in it. So you can take that frass, put it in a petri dish and grow that fungus out from that frass. So when that blows around, it can blow around. In fact, when that lands on the ground, you can pick it up on your feet or you can pick it up on your tires. So it can blow to another tree and infect the other tree, or you can pick it up and move it by accident to a new forest and then maybe infect the other trees there. Some plant diseases are carried by insects, and I'm thinking like banana bunchy top. It's a virus, but it's carried by an aphid. So one of the things that we wanted to know was, are these beetles carrying the disease themselves? And so they actually tested hundreds of beetles by the highly scientific squish test, is you squish a beetle and then you run the DNA to see if it has fungus on it. So about 2.5% of the beetles have some fungus on them. But we really don't think they get into healthy trees very much. On the bottom, you see those are the beetle galleries that the beetles have made, the holes, the tunnels that they've made in a healthy ʻŌhiʻa tree. Well, it was a sick ʻŌhiʻa tree. So one of the things they want to see is, okay, but if those beetles have fungus on them, can they infect the tree with it? So for this study, they said, okay, we'll do an experiment for that. This is Kyle Roy with USGS who did this experiment. So she took beetles and she made them walk through a petri dish with a fungus. So they got fungus all over them. And then she imprisoned them in these little capsules, like a pill that you would take capsule, and imprisoned them in it and glued it to the stem of a seedling. And so the only way for the beetle to get out was to drill into the ʻŌhiʻa tree. And sure enough, when she did that, she found that the ʻŌhiʻa seedlings got the disease. So we know that a beetle drilling into an ʻŌhiʻa seedling can cause it to give disease. A beetle drilling into a tree can give the tree a disease. You might be wondering if some ʻŌhiʻa are resistant to the disease. And the short answer is yes. When we go out in the field, sometimes we see a beautiful ʻŌhiʻa tree just like that one next to all these diseased ones. And we wonder, wow, was that just a lucky tree or was it resistant? So in order to determine something's resistant, you have to do experiments. And the happy young guy there is Blaine Luis. He was a grad student at ʻŌhiʻa who investigated this. In fact, he was an undergraduate intern with us, so only a couple of years out of high school. He interned with us and he was so interested in rapid ʻŌhiʻa death that he's been working with us for over 5 years now, and he did a master's degree on it. So he's really happy because he's showing Phil there his tree that's dying. So what he did is he tested a lot of seedlings of a lot of different varieties, and he inoculated them. He tried to give them the disease, and what he found was some got the disease more often than others. So this is a graph of 4 of the varieties of ʻŌhiʻa we have on the island. So these are all native Hawaiian ʻŌhiʻa varieties. And what he found that some in Kena and Noelii got much less disease than others. And those would be the varieties Glaberrima and Polymorpha. So we know there's some resistance out there, but we don't know how much because Blaine only did 80 trees. To do this kind of study right, you need thousands. So what we're doing now is we have our interns out in the forest collecting from healthy trees that are in diseased areas, because these might be the trees that are resistant to the disease, and growing them out in the nursery. When these little cuttings grow roots and they grow into seedlings that are like the size of a pencil, then we can start testing them by trying to give them the disease and seeing if any survive. So from Blaine's experiment of 3 years ago, there's still a whole bunch of them that are surviving, even though they were given the fungus. All right, next question. Now we're going to pull back and think about the forest and talk about how we find Rapidohea trees in the forest. One of the ways is by using drones. One of the useful things about drones is when you get a report of a tree, say that airplane finds a tree, okay, here it is. It's actually really hard to go in the forest and find out exactly where that tree is. But if you have a drone, it's really easy because you can just fly your drone up and you can see the trees like in this picture. And then you just fly the drone over the tree and follow your GPS and you get to the drone. So for our surveys of our forest, trying to find where the trees are, we do both the helicopter surveys, and the picture in the middle is a guy in a helicopter. He has a tablet, it's like an iPad, and he marks down on the iPad where he thinks trees are. And then on the field, when they get out in the field, they take their drone, and the drone can lead them right to the tree that way. So there's a bunch of helicopter time and there's a bunch of drone, and there's a bunch of high-tech stuff too with all the drones and the imagery analysis stuff. So some of the work in finding out Rapidohea death is marching through the woods and using a chainsaw and cutting trees up and putting them in bags. And some of it is flying helicopters, and some of it is high-tech analysis of disease, of the images for the disease. Now, this is new. One of the things that happens, and especially in the other islands, is you think you see a tree a long ways away that has it. You have to hike all day to get there maybe, and maybe it's in a dense forest and it's hard to cut the tree down. What if you could attach a saw to a drone and cut a branch off and bring it back? So this is Dr. Ryan Peroy at UH Hilo, and he's working on what he calls the kukuao, which is the drone tree sampler. So this is a big drone. It's got 6 motors on it, and it carries this pole. And if you see on the bottom of the pole on the right side, it's a grabber. It has a grabber and has a little saw. So the grabber can grab a branch off the tree and the saw cuts it. And then the drone flies back to Ryan with a little sample on it. So this is pretty cool because you could use this, especially if you picture Oahu or Kauai, you could fly it across to the next ridge, get a sample, and fly back to you carrying a sample. So flying drones with saws, this is pretty cool. Now, can we protect ohia trees from the disease? Answer that is sort of yes, but maybe. This is actually not ohia at all. This is an elm tree in New Hampshire. Elm has a similar disease called Dutch elm disease. And when they started losing these trees, they really wanted to save them because that's right on a college campus. It's a real valuable tree. So what they do on those trees is they give the tree a fungicide every other year. So they drill holes in it and they pump the tree through a fungicide. And then if they ever see the fungus starting to grow, they prune off that branch and then they give the tree more fungicide. So basically the tree is on life support. If they didn't keep giving it the fungicide, it would probably die. But they spend a couple $100 on that tree every other year to give it fungicide to keep it alive, which for one big tree, it's really worth it. But are we going to do this across the forest with millions of trees? No, we're not going to do that. But we did want to know, can we do this with ohia? So we did some experiments. And again, this was mainly Jenny Juswick, Mark Hughes, and Lisa Keith who did this, using a fungicide and pumping it into a tree. So you see here, what we did is we drilled holes in the tree and we poked in little joints and then pumped in fungicide. So that sprayer can full of fungicide took about half an hour to pump all that into a tree. And then afterwards inoculated it with the fungus to see if it did cause disease. Now there's another technology for doing that too. This is this is the ArborJet technology. So this is using a small needle, but a higher concentration, injecting fungicides. Unfortunately, the results of this have been mixed. And again, this is why we do science. This is why we do trials, because it seems like a good idea, Maybe you could put fungicide in the tree so the disease wouldn't grow in the tree. But you have to do trials. And this is something, if you're paying attention to the news, is very much in the news right now. Can we get a vaccine for COVID? Um, they're doing trials, but it's going to take months and months to do the trials to find out if it does more harm than good. Because you don't want to use something that does more harm than good. If you're drilling holes in trees, that does harm. Does the fungicide do more good than harm? You have to do trials. So what we're finding out about this is that the results are mixed and we don't really know. At the high elevation where it's cool, um, a lot of the trees, didn't die that were protected, but a lot of the trees, even if they weren't protected, still didn't die. And what we think is going up in there, and this is way up Saddle Road where it's cool, is the fungus just doesn't grow very well. So even if you inoculate a healthy tree, it might not die. So you don't really know if the fungicide is doing any good. Then down by the airport where it's warm elevation, we found a lot of all the trees that weren't protected with fungicide died, but half of the ones that you did try to protect them with a fungicide died anyway. So it's not perfect. It might be helping a little, but we're still waiting for the results on that. Now, we try to be optimistic about what's going on. And I am for a number of reasons. The main reason is we're figuring out now that the disease is worse in some forests than other forests. Now, when you think of what fungus likes it warm and wet, right? So where is it warm and wet? Puna, Hilo? Yeah, the disease is really bad in Puna, Hilo. Now, if you're in a dry area, you don't have so much fungus problems. So if you're in Puawa, we have not found any disease in Puawa. We find some in Ocean View, but not very much. So we think a lot of forests, and likewise at the higher elevations where it's cooler, we find some disease, but not a whole lot. So we think a lot of our ʻŌhiʻa forests are not going to be vulnerable to disease, but the low elevation ones really are. The initial wave of the disease, one thing we think that it really the disease took off is after Hurricane Iselle. And 6 years ago, a hurricane came ripping through Puna and Hilo and broke many, many trees and broke branches and tore everything up. Then there was a lot of disease after that. So there are events that you get these outbreaks of disease, and then it kind of slows down. And then, like I said, the last hopeful thing is we know there are resistant trees out there, and we hope we can manage the forest so those resistant ones reproduce and we get a more healthy forest. What can you do to protect our forest? Don't move wood around, especially wood, and it could be diseases. So cut ʻŌhiʻa, use the wood, but use it where you cut it. Firewood, if you want to make an imu, use the wood from that area. Don't move a truckload of firewood around from one spot to another because you might be spreading the disease. In fact, the Department of Agriculture put a quarantine in on ʻŌhiʻa that you're not allowed to move ʻŌhiʻa off of Hawaii Island because you might be spreading the disease off of Hawaii Island. So unless you treat it, you can't move anything related to ʻŌhiʻa. You can't move wood, you can't move flowers, you can't move live plants. Now, wood that's been treated, like the flooring up top there, that can be moved because once it's heated, it kills all the fungus. Next thing is don't injure ʻŌhiʻa trees. Yeah, that we know that the fungus gets through when there's open wood. It doesn't go through the bark. But what hits ʻŌhiʻa trees, these are all pictures I took just going around the island. Roadside brushing equipment, you see that big chunk it took out of the ʻŌhiʻa in the left side picture. Pruning, so this is a neighborhood where they're in the ʻŌhiʻa forest, they're in Puna, in one of the subdivisions, and they just went through and topped all their ʻŌhiʻa trees that were underneath the power lines. Or even marking trails, and this is off on a trail that people, as they come by, they take a chop out of the tree with their machete. I understand it helps you find your way back, but please don't do that to ʻŌhiʻa. Do it to something else, some weed tree or something like that, because this tree died of rapid ʻŌhiʻa death. And you could see that people had repeatedly been coming to that part in the woods and chopping a piece off the tree. Then cleaning off your gear before you go into a forest. And this is something, it's not just for ʻŌhiʻa, it's for everything. When you go into a forest, You know, in the Hawaiian culture, they had Wauakua and Waukanaka. Waukanaka is where you are day to day, where people belong. Wauakua was the forest where it was gods and spirits, and you had to do special things before you went there. Um, Maybe part of the special things is cleaning off the weed seeds from your boots, making sure you don't have little fire ants in your truck. And part of it is cleaning off stuff that you're not spreading rapid ʻŌhiʻa. So before we go into a forest, we clean our boots out. We don't have any soil on our boots. We blast underneath our truck. We clean even our chainsaw pants because we don't want to be the guys bringing the disease into some of the nice upland forests. We find that mostly what we use is rubbing alcohol, so soap and water to clean off any of the mud, and then rubbing alcohol kills the fungus with it. Um, that's really the best thing to do to clean things. If you can move the fungus by your boots, how much more by your trucks? So what we do is after we're in the field, we come back to the bait yard, we clean all the mud off our trucks. We use pressure washers, blast it out of the wheel wells. Then if you got in the truck with your muddy boots, take the carpets out, blast the mud off the carpets, just get the soil out of the trucks. And again, the idea is this is not just helping for rapid ʻŌhiʻa death. It helps for things like little fire ants. It helps for weeds. So you're not bringing gorse, you know, from Mauna Kea over to Mauna Loa or other things like that. What do you do if you see a tree that you suspect has rod on this island? If you're in Hamakua or Kohala, let us know. The rest of the island, yeah, we know it's there already. I had a lady call me yesterday from one of the Puna subdivisions reporting, and I just told her, yep, you know, we know it's there. We're not going to send someone out because we already got 100 samples from your subdivision. But in Hamakua or Kohala, we will let either Dofa or the Big Island invasive species know about it and track it down there. And then stay away from the area where the tree is until we're diagnosed. We are encouraging people to keep planting ʻŌhiʻa. One thing we found out is the small trees tend not to get the disease unless you weed whack them. So if you plant an ʻŌhiʻa tree, make a nice bed of mulch around it. Don't hit it with a string trimmer or the weed whacker. Don't hit it with herbicide, and it'll grow. So we're encouraging people to keep planting ʻŌhiʻa trees. These guys are with the ʻŌhiʻa Legacy on Oahu, and Oahu, they don't have so much ʻŌhiʻa, or the ʻŌhiʻa they have is up in the mountains and people don't see it. So they did an ʻŌhiʻa sale, and they sold out like in half an hour. And he's like, oh man, I wish I had more plants. So thanks to them for doing these ʻŌhiʻa sales, and keep planting ʻŌhiʻa. Most of our forests on the island are still healthy, and we want to keep it that way. So this is Mauna Kea. This is looking over the forest above Hilo, looking up to the mountain of Mauna Kea. All the light trees in the area are koa. All the dark trees there are ʻŌhiʻa. And so we want to keep this forest healthy with your help, and we can do it. So thanks again. I'm JB Friday. RapidOhiaDeath.org is our program website. If you go facebook.com Rapid ʻŌhiʻa Death, it's our Facebook page, and our Instagram.com/ʻŌhiʻa Life is our Instagram, where we post pictures, not just Rapid ʻŌhiʻa Death, but of ʻŌhiʻa, our connections to ʻŌhiʻa, the cultural values of ʻŌhiʻa, and just what a beautiful tree it is. So for more information, there are places you can go for all those. Thanks for listening, and have a good day. Aloha.
Aloha. Thank you, JB.
All right. Okay,
Yeah.
there you have a recording.